Welcome to the spectrum of sonship. From acorn to oak, from infant to mature son, this series is all about the Father's process of maturing his sons, and together we'll explore each stage of growth and the Father's work to bring his sons unto full stature. This really is the slow fire process of discipleship. Thanks for coming back today, and I want to say a big hello to those of you who are listening to this podcast for the first time. Welcome to you from wherever you are listening today. At the moment, you could be in one of the 23 nations which make up this audience, or you could be from a brand new nation. And it's a real privilege to be able to share what I'm releasing here to such a wide audience. And I really do pray that these podcasts are helping you in your maturing sonship. As much as possible, I do try to script these podcast episodes to make sure that I'm using language which I hope many of you are able to understand and connect with. And if you're listening to this very episode now and you've not heard the previous 5 in this series on the spectrum of sonship, I'd encourage you to go back and to listen to those so that you're part of this unfolding story of the spectrum of sonship. And so if part 1 of the breaking showed us the necessity of the breaking, and part 2 exposed the futility of self-life, the vows we make in the flesh, and the absolute necessity of the cross, then part 3 today must become a little more personal. What does it actually look like to walk through this breaking when these crashes come? And there are the principles of breaking and the recognition that the breaking of the soul is his way. But then there is the lived reality. For me, it was not only gradual dealings over a series of big crashes, but a sudden crisis that had been brewing for decades. It was his way, and it changed everything, including the trajectory of my whole life. So today I'm going to share my story with you of how this has looked like, and then through the rest of this week, what it has started to look like on the other side. This breaking which we are talking about started when I became a believer at the age of 9, because I had 9 years of independent living. There was then a huge crash in 2010. And then the second crash just over 5.5 years ago is the one that truly broke everything. And it's important to state that yes, I had built 9 years of living independently before I was saved, but I also continued to build in independence for a further 30 plus years because I had never truly heard what I now know. And I look back at all that the Father has set in motion over these 5.5 years, and I could never have foreseen what he has done in those years and where I find myself today. In the September of 2017, along with 2 friends, I moved from the UK to Poland to start a new life as a missionary, full of vision, energy, and with huge ambition. I'd spent 17 years in education here in the UK as a director of music of a large secondary school, and in the final few years of my career as an assistant head teacher. And the initial first few years in Poland for us were very tough. We each suffered loss in our families, and life was incredibly challenging on all fronts. In October of 2019, we lost my mum. And this month of October in 2025, we have just celebrated 6 years of my mum being at home with him in eternity. And though we had known it was coming, her death still triggered something very deep within me. And this grief was sharper and more devastating than anything I had expected, not only because of the loss itself, but because of the way I had interpreted it. For years, I had processed everything through the filter of rejection. And so even her death, I processed as a deep rejection and another abandonment. And it revealed just how deeply my self-life had been shaped, constantly craving affirmation, leaning heavily on others for love, and never secure within. And her passing pierced through all of that, touching the raw nerve that stretched all the way back to my earliest years. And I tell you this now, but this depth of processing, all of this has taken these last 5.5 years. Because just a few months after my mum died, at the end of February in 2020, I returned to Poland. The Father had spoken to me from Hebrews 11 about how Abraham found his promises in a foreign nation, and that my promises were also in another nation, and that he had moved me for this purpose. But I had no idea that he was taking me back to this nation of Poland to utterly break me. And in truth, he had been bringing me to that point for many decades. There had been times when his dealings were closing in, but I had backed away or even prayed against them, not realizing it was him all along. Again and again, he had arranged situations and circumstances to expose my self life, but I always ran back to people instead of to him. I had never really trusted him. And this was the deepest controversy that I had. It was between me and the Father. So when I arrived back in Poland in 2020, everything I had built in my flesh and self life to manage my need for love began to collapse. One by one, every support system, every source of affirmation, every relationship I thought I needed was stripped away. It was as if the Father was saying, "This is enough now. There is too much written over your life to be stuck in this place any longer." And so I found myself isolated on a farm in the southwest of the country, cut off not only from people, but even from reliable internet. And what was going on back in the early days of 2020? COVID. We were in huge lockdown. To get a phone signal, I had to climb a ridge behind the farm, which took over an hour. And for someone who had always been surrounded by people, projecting an extrovert persona, this was the most desolate place I could have ever imagined. The silence was absolutely suffocating. The absence of affirmation left me restless, and I realized that I really had become addicted to people, to their touch, to their encouragement, to their attention. And now all of it was gone, including the one person who truly did know me, and that was, at the time, my mum. And during this season of intense isolation, I had nowhere to run or hide, and the Father had me exactly where He wanted me. And so by May 2020, I'd reached the breaking point. On a very hot day, I went up onto the ridge into the forest with no intention of coming back. It was that dark. I could not see a way out, and my whole life had been built around needing people to affirm me, hug me, give me time and attention. I believed that if I could not feel or experience love in that way, then love was not real to me. I even told people openly, these are the ways in which you should show me love, because that is what I thought I needed. But in reality, what I was demanding was that they feed my flesh. It is amazing how something called the love languages became the ammunition I needed to manipulate those around me, telling them how they should love me. And now, in the middle of a forest, in the middle of a foreign country, there were no people left to do that. And so the shell of this outward man was finally beginning to crack. That day, lying on the forest floor, he met me. He embraced me so tightly in my whole being that I thought I would suffocate. And I heard him say this: "Don't you think that I can be all that you need? Don't you trust me to be everything for you and to you?" And in that moment, something within me broke, because what was exposed was that I didn't trust him. In fact, over those coming days, weeks, and months, it became very apparent that I blamed him for everything. And isn't that what happened in the Garden of Eden? Adam blamed God and Eve for the whole thing when he said, "It's the woman's fault and you gave her to me." And so I'm not going to pretend everything changed in that instant on the forest floor. But from that day onward, I knew he had my full attention. I started to believe he could be everything I needed. He could hold me. He could meet my deepest need for love. And it was the beginning of what I now understand as a crucifixion that I had never really truly understand. And at that moment, I still didn't truly understand it. I had zero revelation that I was crucified in him, in spirit, my old Adam man. And that when he rose from the dead, I was resurrected in him as the new man, the new creation. And that I didn't just have a new life, I had his divine, uncreated, eternal life. I had no revelation of this truth at that time because I'd never heard it as explicitly as that or read it in any of the Christian books that I had. I also had no knowledge or revelation of the breaking that we've been talking about over the past 2 episodes, and I certainly had never heard of a self-life in the way that I now understand it. And so from that point forward, he began to place new people in my life, men and women who did walk in this revelation and did not pander to my flesh patterns, but walked alongside me as the Father began to deal with me. They didn't try to get in his way or try to fix me. They simply stood alongside me as he stripped away decades of shame-based living. Slowly, without me even realizing it, the way I thought, felt, and processed life began to change. The shame that had ruled me for more than 30 plus years was dying because the cross was literally being thrown at it minute by minute. This wasn't therapy or counseling. He was dealing death blow after death blow to all that was not from his life. Looking back, I can see how toxic relationships and codependencies had to be exposed. I had tried to get my needs met through people rather than from him since I was a young child. I had worshipped the creature instead of the creator. Every hug, every affirmation became a substitute for trusting him as the source. Now, don't get me wrong, I like a hug and I like to give a hug, but I don't need you now to hug me when he is the one who meets my need in that way. When those relationships broke down, when people distanced themselves or walked out, I interpreted it, of course, as more rejection. And as I mentioned earlier, even my mum's death, I processed through the lens of rejection. But the Father was showing me that all of this was the false foundation of the self-life. And he wanted to expose it, break it, kill it, and replace it with himself. He said to me, "Do you actually trust me to be everything for you?" And with no one else to run to, I needed the revelation that he alone is enough. And so this sudden breaking had been prepared for years. It exposed my toxic relationships, codependencies, my cravings for creature comfort, and my worship of people. It tore down the structures I had built to survive, and it's still ongoing today. In their place, the Father began to build something new, a Son who wholly belongs to him and lives from his indwelling life, a revelation that has utterly transformed the way I now live with him. Around the time of the Easter weekend in 2023, I went to a cross encounter in Poland, which is a weekend I cannot even begin to describe on this podcast. But it's the doorway into this way of life. It is the gospel. And it's the way that the Father has given to my great friend, partner in the work, and mentor, Nancy McCready, who was at the time regularly coming in and out of Europe on assignment with this incredible way of presenting the gospel. And all I remember was that over these 2.5 days, I heard the gospel, I think, for the first time, and it left me utterly dumbstruck. Revelation after revelation of what they, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, have always wanted, and that I was what they have always wanted. I heard things like, I don't just do the will of God, I am the will of God. And I could go on and on. But this time gave me a framework and an understanding of everything that I was walking through. One of the sessions helped me to see the deeper meaning of John 12:24. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much grain. And the breaking was the falling and the dying of my soul life. My natural self, the shell, had to be shattered so that the life within could come forth. And I finally began to understand over that weekend what Paul meant in 2 Corinthians 4:7, that we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. And so my jar had to be broken. My clay vessel had to be shattered because only then the treasure could be seen. And since then, the Father has continued his breaking in many ways. Further dealings in Texas in 2024, more layers of self exposed, including the breaking of my natural abilities, all of the training that I'd been through with my work, the professional development, my degrees, and the confidence I had put in my previous experiences. Each step has been another layer of breaking, another unveiling of his life within me. And he can only use these abilities if the source of self has been broken and he becomes the source of everything. And so this process doesn't stop. If you've seen the graphic on the link below, you will see that as we allow him to continue this breaking process, the deeper our abiding development grows with him. He is maturing his sons to become a fuller expression of his way of life, learning to live and share their way of life. And this is what discipleship is all about. And so the irony is that I'd gone to Poland in arrogance, thinking I had something to give and a huge ministry to found. But I returned to the UK in 2023 for family reasons with something I had never known before. And that's the reality of being a crucified person. I had preached Galatians 2:20, for I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. But I had not been living it because I'd never had a revelation of it. And now, through pain, isolation, and breaking, I began to understand what Paul was really saying. I saw that my life was no longer about getting my needs met independently, but about living from him and unto him and letting him tend to me, nourish me, and meet all of my needs as a son. And so during this season, I also saw the self life for the very first time. I realized that for most of my Christian life, I had been living in the flesh. And again, what is the flesh? It's all of the ways, both good and evil, that I have tried to meet my own needs out of my own resources, independent from him. It's the self life reaching for comfort, for security, for love, and trying to draw it from created things rather than the creator himself. And this was me. Always running to people, always looking for affirmation, always depending on others to sustain me. And in that forest, the Father exposed the reality that I had been living in the flesh and calling it Christianity. Watchman Nee, in the chapter Man's First Sin from his book, The Messenger of the Cross, he shows us where this comes from. In the garden, Adam chose the tree of knowledge of good and evil rather than the tree of life. And that choice was not simply about morality, it was about independence. Watchman Nee writes that man's first sin was not only disobedience, but the decision to live by his own resource apart from God. And the tree of knowledge represents self-sufficiency, deciding for ourselves what is good and evil, relying on our own strength to live, and cutting ourselves off from the flow of his divine life. And this is the essence of flesh. And in that season, I realized I had been living from the wrong tree. Even in ministry, even in the things that look good, I was drawing from my own intellect, emotions, and will. And I thought I was serving God. I was doing things for Him, but I was serving out of independence. I was eating daily from the tree of knowledge, while all along the tree of life, Christ Himself was being offered to me. And this is what Nee meant when he said that the root of sin is independence, the self life refusing to rely on God because it simply cannot. And so much of my energy had been spent trying to meet my own needs. When I felt insecure, I sought reassurance from people. When I felt unloved, I demanded affection. And when I felt weak, I reached for my natural abilities, experiences, and my own cleverness. I was feeding the flesh. And the flesh, no matter how religious or impressive it looks, is hostile to God. Romans 8:7 says, and I quote, "The mind of the flesh, with its carnal thoughts and purposes, is hostile to God, for it does not submit itself to God's law. Indeed, it cannot." And that was me. I had been in church, in ministry, even in leadership, and at that time a missionary, but I was living as an independent man, hostile to God's own life. The worst part was that I was actually instructing others how they should show me love, framing it through the 5 love languages as I've mentioned previously, and I was also teaching others how to do the same. Shockingly, I was even trying to use the same tactics on the Father Himself. And so later I did come to realize that people do love me. Indeed, they loved me a huge amount, but they loved me in their own way without my prompting. But I'd been too toxic and self-centered to recognize it. And so the breaking of 2020 was therefore not just about pain or circumstances. It was about the exposure of this independence at its very root. It was the Father showing me that every time I ran to people, every time I relied on myself, I was choosing the wrong tree. The true issue was not my wounds, but the self-life. And the cross had to cut right through my independence so that I could finally begin to live from the tree of life, Christ Himself, who is indwelling me as life. Watchman Nee writes in The Release of the Spirit, and I quote, "Brokenness is the way of blessing, the way of fragrance, the way of fruitfulness. It is also a path sprinkled with blood from our wounds." And so here's the paradox. The very things that wound us, the things that seem to strip us of strength, are the things that cause the fragrance of Christ to be released from deep within us. Without brokenness, the treasure remains hidden in the vessel. With brokenness, the treasure shines forth. We've already mentioned the alabaster flask, but it was not the value of the flask that filled the house, it was the ointment inside. And Watchman Nee comments that many treasure the alabaster box more than the ointment. They admire their own cleverness, their emotions, their personality, and their gifts, and they guard the vessel, but unless the vessel is broken, the fragrance is never released. And the breaking of the outward man allows the inward life of Christ to fill the room. And this is the fruit of brokenness, that the life of Christ, the glory of God Himself, becomes tangible to the world. Prayer carries weight because it comes from the Spirit, not from soulish emotion and effort. And I've talked a little about prayer on this podcast before, and I'm probably going to return to it again in the near future. Worship carries a fragrance because it flows from a broken vessel, not a polished performance. Ministry carries life because it's spirit to spirit, not soul to soul. Outward man intact means noise, effort, and a lot of hard graft, whereas outward man broken means life, His fragrance, His fruitfulness. An unbroken man is still carrying the weight of his own life, and we were never meant to carry the weight of our own lives. For those of you who are in leadership or carry some responsibility and have ever come to a point of burnout, it should never have come to that, because burnout doesn't exist for mature sons who have ceased to carry the weight of their own lives. And yes, we need to rest physically, but burnout is almost always emotional and mental. And this is not his way for those who live their way of life and from their way of life. And so as we get ready to close out today, I want to read to you from 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 7 through 12. And I'm going to read from the English Standard Version. And Paul writes this: "But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. For we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life in you." And so the broken vessel releases life to others. Our wounds become channels of his life. And Frank Viola notes that Paul's imagery shows how God deliberately places his glory in fragile vessels, so that when they crack under pressure, the source of life is unmistakably Christ and not human strength. The clay jar is never meant to impress. Its very weakness is the stage upon which resurrection life is displayed. And so for me, the reality of this breaking has been deeply personal. The forest floor in Poland, the isolation, the stripping away of every support, those moments of despair became the very places where his life began to flow out of me. Brokenness is absolutely necessary to get his life out of us. The very places where I was crushed, perplexed, and struck down have become the very places where his life now flows to others. And this is the power of the cross working in the sons, death working in us, life working in you. And so this is why we must embrace the breaking, for it's here that the treasure is revealed and the fragrance of Christ fills the earth. Breaking is absolutely essential for anyone desiring to mature as a son unto the Father. And so as we close today, I want to make this very clear. There is no maturing without brokenness. I was stuck in infancy for many years, going around the same issues, coming to the same points of breaking over and over again, but never fully embracing them because I didn't know that they were from him. And then the day came where I could avoid it no longer. There is only one way the Father matures us as his sons, and that is through training, discipline, and the breaking of our independence. And let me say this as clearly as I can. If you are still trying to do things for God, then you have not yet entered his way of life. We were never required to do things for God, but to do things with him and from his life. And so I say this with all love and honor. It's time for the sons to stop running around trying to do things for God and to learn his way of life and move with him. He is moving right now across the globe, and he is looking for mature sons who will move with him without any concern for themselves. So we are about to head into the final stage of sonship, the mature son, the weos, and discover what it looks like to live with him and to become a true expression of his life in the earth.